Greetings and welcome to the United States Transhumanist Party Virtual Enlightenment Salon. My name is Gennady Stolyarov II, and I am the chairman of the US Transhumanist Party. Here we hold conversations with some of the world's leading thinkers in longevity, science, technology, philosophy, and politics. Like the philosophers of the Age of Enlightenment, we aim to connect every field of human endeavor and arrive at new insights to achieve longer lives, greater rationality, and the progress of our civilization.
Thanks for tuning in to Minds of Tomorrow. I'm your host, Luis Acevedo, and with me today I have a special guest. His name is Gennady Stolyarov, and he is the chairman of the Transhumanist Party of the United States of America, as well as the chief executive for the Nevada Transhumanist Party. In addition to that, he's actually a science fiction author, and he's an artist too. He is trying to create a new movement in art called Abstract Orderism. And I must say, your artwork is very fascinating. Before we got on the interview here, I was just browsing through it again. And one that made me chuckle, and it was obviously intended to because it was a satirical piece, was Jesus in Substance. I read your description and why you did that, and I was like, oh, I can relate to that so much. So I found that very humorous. So today we're going to be talking about what transhumanism is and what are the goals of the Transhumanist Party, as well as, getting a little personal with who you are, how you came to, this philosophical viewpoint. Now, when I was telling my friends and family who I was going to be having next on my show, the one question they would always ask is, what is transhumanism? And so I find that this, even though it's becoming more popular, is still a novel idea for the majority of people. And I know that the definition can be debated from what I understand as to what direction transhumanism will go into. Now, from your perspective, could you maybe expand on that definition of transhumanism to begin with?
Yes, absolutely. I would say this is also the observation that I have had with regard to most people's reactions to transhumanism. Generally, when I speak about it to people who are not within the transhumanist community and who are not within media, politics, or academia, generally those people are encountering it for the first time. But that gives me a good opportunity to accurately explain what transhumanism is. I would characterize transhumanism as the philosophy and movement which advocate for the use of science and technology to fundamentally overcome the limitations of the human condition. And that doesn't mean that we would cease to be human. That doesn't mean that we would discard the beneficial or valuable aspects of our humanity. Rather, we would overcome those obstacles, those built-in flaws that have held humans back and indeed have destroyed humans since the inception of our species. Obstacles such as death, disease, and decay, material scarcity, poverty, the tendency toward conflict and zero-sum thinking, various flaws in human psychology such as cognitive biases or irrational emotions. All of those have held humans back, and transhumanists are among the foremost to recognize the amazing potentialities of human beings, our rational faculty, our creative faculty, our ability to be benevolent and ethical and to improve not just our own lives, but the lives of other beings as well. No other species really has the same potential for good as we humans do, at least no other species that we know of. But we are held back by these unfortunate flaws within our own biology and within the so-called natural world. So transhumanism seeks to harness a part of what it means to be human that has also been with us since our species came to be. And that is the ability to use our reason, to apply it, to shape the external reality, to develop tools by which we can improve our lives. Even, for instance, the eyeglasses that you are wearing give you capabilities that your distant ancestors would not have had. You are able to live in a way that would have been inaccessible to them. Moreover, the technology we're using right now is actually a fairly explicitly transhumanist technology. FM 2030, the great transhumanist writer of the 1960s through the 1990s, called it telepresence. And he actually wrote about how in a few decades' time, people would be meeting via telepresence and having exactly the kinds of conversations that you and I are having right now.
Right. Yeah. And it was funny today when I was going for my walk, I started thinking, I'm familiar with FM 20, but I didn't know that he mentioned that. I'm only familiar as far as Wikipedia goes. So when I was walking today, I was thinking to myself, we're already kind of living in a transhumanist world because of my cell phone in my pocket. It already makes me more advanced than my ancestors were. And there was something you brought up in your definition that made me think of how when I have talked about transhumanism with people, they seem to get the idea that we'll become cyborgs. But from my understanding, cyborgs are completely different than the viewpoint of the transhumanists. Like a cyborg would be subhuman in a way, like an android, if I'm not mistaken, if that's the correct definition. But another thing that you touched on, which makes me think that this is probably an opportune time for a political party such as this, is the division that we're experiencing, the irrationality, the emotions are very high. And so it's a good time to try and find unity because we see two parties dying. And we're seeing this with a lot of systems right now, whether it be economic or healthcare and political. Our main infrastructure seems to be crumbling. And that's why we get a lot of this doom and gloom narrative. However, we are, we're adaptive as a species. And so that's why philosophies like these tend to rise at times like these. Now, where I want to go into next is how did you actually come to this philosophical viewpoint? I read your children's book, The Death is Wrong, so I'm sure it stems all the way back from that. But if you would care to expand a little bit as to how you came to this viewpoint.
Yes, absolutely. And I would encourage everyone watching this interview to read Death is Wrong as well, because it does speak to key aspects of my journey. But essentially, it started out as me being the kind of willful, persistent child who would refuse to accept certain commonly posited justifications or worldviews, especially about death and mortality. I was aghast when I was a young child to learn that people just died after a certain age and they didn't have to do anything wrong in order to meet that fate. It was just a fate that everyone encountered eventually. And for me, that felt like a supreme injustice. And I think many children, when they encounter this unfortunate reality, they also react to it in a manner of outrage and in a manner that rebels against it. However, humankind, having been truly faced with inevitable mortality for much of its history because of insufficiently advanced technology, has developed quite advanced coping mechanisms with death, be those coping mechanisms religious or secular. So some of the religious justifications might be, well, there's an afterlife, or it's God's will, it's all part of God's plan. Some of the secular justifications might be, well, it's natural, it's part of the circle of life, and we are all stardust, and shouldn't we be happy about that? Well, I was never content with any of those explanations or justifications. I thought, this is a problem. It is a problem that needs to be overcome. And moreover, I really appreciate being alive. I enjoy the opportunities that life provides me, and indeed, life is the prerequisite for everything. So when I was 5 years old, I realized that essentially preserving life is the fundamental goal, without which there is nothing, no sensation, no emotion, no thinking. And so I would dedicate my life to the struggle against death. I didn't know at the time whether that struggle would ultimately be successful, whether our technological capabilities were advanced enough for most of my early teenage years, I thought this is a vision for the future of humanity. Sometime in a few centuries, perhaps, humankind will be able to overcome death. And my job was to kind of lay the philosophical foundation for that to be an acceptable goal for people to strive toward. And then in 2004, I encountered the work of Dr. Aubrey de Grey. And Aubrey de Grey, of course, is the founder of the SENS approach, which stands for Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence. And his key point, which I understood at the time because I had just finished taking my advanced placement biology course in high school, is that one doesn't have to understand all of the complexities of human metabolism that contribute to aging, because that is indeed a highly complex process. It's a highly interdependent process, but one can more simply follow a set of engineering approaches to reverse the damage that has already occurred without changing the fundamental process by which future damage will arise. But that essentially would set back the biological clock. So suffice it to say, if rejuvenation therapies are developed for each of the 7 main types of damage that Aubrey de Grey identified, and there are various classification systems, so some scientists would classify those same types of damage into 9 or 10 categories, but it's essentially the same set of types of damage. Then, say, a biological 60-year-old could again become a biological 40-year-old, and that buys that individual an additional 20 years of life for new treatments, improved therapies to be developed, and thus a person who lives to be able to benefit from the first rejuvenation therapies may likely reach a state called longevity escape velocity, where because that person's biological clock will be reset periodically, there will no longer be a decline in remaining life expectancy with each passing year. So when I understood that idea, I realized that it is indeed possible, certainly not guaranteed, but possible for us within our lifetimes to benefit from enough medical progress to reach longevity escape velocity. And then I realized, well, if it's possible, if it's attainable, then that fundamentally changes the incentive structure and the goals that people should have to try to bring that outcome about. And shortly thereafter, I learned about the philosophy of transhumanism, which encompasses this pursuit of life extension, but also encompasses various other advanced technologies. I read the writings of Max More and the principles of extropy, which were an early attempt to outline the various values and pursuits within transhumanism. Then I read Ray Kurzweil's work, The Singularity is Near, followed by actually some of his earlier books, The Age of Spiritual Machines, The Age of Intelligent Machines. And those books discussed the progress of technology and computing, in automation and artificial intelligence, in genome sequencing, and posited essentially exponential growth trajectories in more realms of technology than would be commonly recognized. Moore's law, of course, is quite frequently cited within the realm of computing, but Ray Kurzweil pointed out progress in genome sequencing actually follows a steeper exponential trajectory than Moore's law. And that also leads us to consider the possibilities a few decades hence, that this technology would advance not linearly in a manner we can extrapolate intuitively, but exponentially. So that to me also suggested we may be living in a dramatically different world a few decades from now. But what have I seen in the surrounding society in terms of people preparing for that future? Not very much. We have the old divisive, polarized two-party system in the United States. And that system seems to thrive on this kind of short-term us versus them mentality, and seeks to transform the supporters of each side into the analogs of sports fans, essentially. They're rooting for their own team. If we're all lucky, It's a more or less respectful competition. We haven't been that fortunate in the past several election cycles. There seems to be a downward spiraling dynamic of toxicity and hatred and all-encompassing division seeping into areas of life that were previously apolitical. And of course, those kinds of politicians with their short-term orientation do not consider and do not talk about those dynamics that could really transform our lives, even as those transformations are underway. So the impacts of science and technology, the impacts of automation, the impacts of biotech, the impacts of nanotechnology, of artificial intelligence, of space travel, of new paradigms of agriculture, of new paradigms of energy. All of those are in development and in many cases in deployment as we speak. And yet how many politicians actually speak about them to their constituents? And I realized this current political paradigm, when combined with sluggish institutions that impose very high barriers for any innovators to get permission or approval to implement their ideas, that is what could derail the arrival of this bright future of longer lifespans, greater prosperity, greater human fulfillment. And something needs to be done on the political front in order to help bring that future about. That is to say, while Ray Kurzweil posited these exponential trajectories, over time it became increasingly apparent to me that even while the technological capabilities to implement certain innovations were there, political, institutional, cultural, societal factors often prevented them from being implemented. Take autonomous vehicles, for example. Ray Kurzweil predicted deployment of autonomous vehicles by 2009. Technically speaking, the technology existed in 2009 to have an autonomous vehicle. DARPA had competitions before 2009 where autonomous vehicles drove safely from one end of the United States to the other. And yet, even today, we don't have widespread adoption of autonomous vehicles. And that is purely because of cultural and institutional resistance. So how do we overcome that? That's where the Transhumanist Party comes in. And I was fortunate enough to have been connected to Zoltan Istvan, who is the founder of the Transhumanist Party. But before he founded the Transhumanist Party, in 2013, he published a book called The Transhumanist Wager. And in The Transhumanist Wager, he had this ambitious and quite controversial plot. It was a work of fiction, but it was a work of fiction that was intended to illustrate perhaps a less desirable future in which there's a clash between transhumanists and anti-transhumanists. And a lot of people took it as more of a manifesto for what Zoltan wanted to happen. I wrote a more nuanced review, which was in many ways positive, but in some ways critical of the book. Zoltan really appreciated my review because he thought it was an honest assessment. It actually engaged with the book as it was, rather than making strawman characterizations. It was intellectually honest. So he and I essentially started this kind of set of intellectual interactions where we would follow one another's work. And when I published my illustrated children's book, Death is Wrong, in late 2013, Zoltan reviewed it. He helped to promote it. He helped to make large numbers of people aware of it by publishing a commentary on it in Psychology Today. And he kept me apprised of his endeavors, including his presidential campaign, which he launched on October 7th, 2014, which is when the Transhumanist Party was founded. And Zoltan is famous for having his coffin-shaped immortality bus driving all over the country with it and really attracting publicity to the life extensionist and transhumanist causes. He recognized that the political barriers to entry were too high for him to actually have a chance of winning, but it is excellent publicity to even run for office and have something of the level of prominence and interest that the immortality bus attracted in order to engage people who might not be following scientific publications or academic conferences or reading philosophy literature. And those people, however, might be interested in politics and might be attracted to unusual political candidates. So he ran this campaign, but not everybody in the transhumanist movement was satisfied with the tactics and strategy that he pursued. So there were some tensions within the movement. And while I was not on the immortality bus myself, I ended up de facto spending a fair amount of time online trying to mediate those tensions. And I think Zoltan saw a certain diplomatic faculty within me and recognized that I had an ability to keep this movement together, given that Zoltan only intended to initiate the Transhumanist Party. He never wanted to control it. He never wanted to be a perpetual leader for it. So he first recommended that I found the Nevada Transhumanist Party, which I did on August 31st, 2015. And that is a party that has been officially registered with the Nevada Secretary of State's office for over 6 years now. And he gave me complete autonomy in running it, determining its platform, its activities. And I realized that there is some potential for transhumanist politics, notwithstanding the barriers to entry. There's a lot of good that can be done in that sphere just by making people aware of transhumanism, exposing them to the transformative potential of technology. When the 2016 election campaign concluded, Zoltan decided to step down from his role as chairman of the US Transhumanist Party, and he asked me to be the next chairman, precisely because he thought I could continue this endeavor in a logical and structured manner, and also interact with the various different points of view within the transhumanist movement, the various personalities, the various organizations, in a diplomatic fashion, try to bring them together under a big tent and hopefully discover that we have more in common than what divides us. So I've very much tried to follow that in the ensuing now nearly 5 years, where I attempted to steer clear of the partisan divisions and say that no matter what one's conventional views, whether you're a Republican, a Democrat, a Libertarian, a Green, a Socialist, or anything else, or none of the above, or apolitical, you're still welcome within the US Transhumanist Party if you share 3 core ideals. And even if you don't entirely agree with the formulation of those 3 core ideals, if you're interested in how science and technology will affect the future of humanity, if you're willing to have conversations about it in a civil and rational fashion, you're still welcome, because we want to have these discussions with earnest and thoughtful individuals. So that is how my involvement in transhumanism brought me to this point, where the US Transhumanist Party is a growing organization. We have over 3,400 members now. We have our weekly virtual enlightenment salons, where we have conversations very much like this one with various eminent thinkers. And we try to make a difference in political campaigns and legislation, in the public discourse.
Yeah, and the thing that really attracts me to the Transhumanist Party is the fact that there's unity there. With any other third party, there doesn't appear to be a figurehead leading it or any cohesion. It's all sort of, I don't want to say decentralized, but there's no central authority. Like, for instance, I'm not too familiar with the Green Party, so I can't speak on them, but the Libertarian Party I can speak on. And there's a lot of division within that political party, which is why you'll never see a libertarian candidate, actually succeed in a political run, or maybe even the Senate in most cases, right? And so that's really impressive that you're able to maintain the cohesion within the party and focus on what is nonpartisan, essentially. And from what I was understanding is that basically this, where you're at currently, is sort of like your life's calling from a young age. This is something that you've sort of envisioned, maybe not necessarily political like you stated earlier, but you knew that you wanted to work on something that would enhance humanity, improve humanity, and beat what you would consider an enemy. And that is, hopefully I'm not putting words in your mouth by calling death an enemy, but that would be sort of my interpretation of your view on that. Now, one thing that I do find when it comes to beating death, quote unquote, is people are very adverse to the idea. They are not open to it. They're very closed-minded to it, and they're very closed-minded to the idea of even longevity, like anti-aging medicine, because there's this stigma with aging in general, right? The older you get, the poorer quality of life one has. But what I think, where I think there's a disconnect is what's trying to be done on the medical side of things is to keep the quality of life, as you stated, consistent throughout your aging. So that way, when you're 60, it's more so like you're 20 or 30, whatever that may be. So you're still relatively young physically, as opposed to deteriorating as you age. And so I think there's a disconnect there too, as well. And I think a lot of that comes from the status quo. People just accept it, as you were saying before, that we come up with these coping mechanisms, whether it be religious or some other, philosophical view that you see fitting to answer the question of death. And so I think it's very, I would even say brave to embark on this endeavor and try to become something on a national scale. Now, I do have a question. If I'm understanding this correctly, when you took over, there was some restructuring of the party itself. Could you maybe go into a little more detail as to what that entailed, what the old party looked like as opposed to what it looks like today?
Yes. Well, first of all, I will say death is indeed an enemy, and I consider it to be such. And I agree that a lot of the resistance that one encounters to the idea of defeating death or prolonging lifespans through science and technology stems from a combination of misunderstanding as well as ingrained cultural resistance born out of this underlying notion of the futility of fighting against aging. So if it's futile, people try to convince themselves that aging is somehow a good thing, and that's what we need to break through. Now, in terms of the Transhumanist Party structure, prior to my becoming chairman, essentially Zoltan was doing everything for the Transhumanist Party. He was the only official member of it, and he was driving the bus. He was giving interviews to journalists. He was writing all of the documents. Essentially, it was a one-man show, and he wanted it to be that way. But of course, very few people have that kind of stamina, as well as the resources that he had to actually devote several months of his life full-time to driving a bus around the country and giving all of these interviews. So when I became chairman, I started out with 3 members being in the party, who were Zoltan, myself, and Rowan Horn, who had accompanied Zoltan on the Immortality bus. And I opened up the Transhumanist Party to new members. And I realized we need to have the barriers to entry be as low as possible. So other parties would charge for membership. We didn't. We set up membership as being free. We set up membership as being accessible worldwide. So not only are US citizens able to become members, but anyone who is capable of forming a political opinion, which would include people who reside in other countries, children who are capable of forming political opinions, as well as in the future, if we discover or encounter any other sentient entities, those would be welcome to apply for membership as well.
If you don't mind, so basically what the party's, I'm inferring here from what you said, the party's goal is to be more so a global political party. Is that correct?
I would say it is our goal to spearhead the international transhumanist movement. Now, there's a bit of a distinction here because there are some countries with their own transhumanist parties and transhumanist organizations. good examples being the United Kingdom, Australia, Canada, France, and we aren't necessarily involved in local political issues in those countries. We will defer to the transhumanist parties and other transhumanist organizations who are there on the ground. But we do welcome the people from those organizations to join the US Transhumanist Party and participate in our internal deliberations and votes regarding what our platform provisions should be. Should we endorse a particular person as a candidate? And these are internal votes, so they're not voting in official US elections. They're simply voting on what the US Transhumanist Party should do. So this was another structural innovation after I became chairman. And Zoltan had encouraged me to do this, to shift from a process of essentially one man making all the decisions, which was the case under Zoltan, to a system of voting by the members so that we could find what the consensus positions, or at least the majority positions within the transhumanist community on various issues were. And instead of doing the conventional divisive plurality or first past the post voting, internally we implemented electronic ranked preference voting, not just for candidates whom we endorsed, but for options for platform wordings or wordings of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. So Zoltan wrote the original 6-article Transhumanist Bill of Rights. We are now on version 3.0 of the Transhumanist Bill of Rights, which has been greatly expanded pursuant to contributions from our members. So this voting process, it helps keep our members engaged. It enables us to consider their input. It enables us to have a more small d democratic structure of governance. So by doing that, hopefully we've been able to bring in more people and more voices and do that in a way that is constructive, because people realize even if their number one choice doesn't win, their votes still meant something. Their rank ordering still contributed to the outcome. And moreover, they realize, yes, in any group that is large enough, there are going to be differences of opinion, differences of preference. But when you have a voting mechanism like this, people see themselves as having that ability to advocate for their preferences and see if they can convince enough people, see if they can get portions of their views adopted by the organization. That's always an option for our members. So I think that restructuring also led to a change in the culture of the organization, where we invite people in as a big tent. We don't try to keep out individuals who might have different points of view. We try to make sure that people exchange ideas openly and constructively. So I think that has worked. I think that has contributed to our organization being a safe haven in times of political turmoil.
Right on. Yeah. And I like the ranked based system. I think Australia, if I'm not mistaken, that's how they have their elections. Did that have any inspiration for
Actually, I found out about that about 2 years after implementing ranked preference voting in the US Transhumanist Party, because a good friend of mine, Steele Archer, who had an interview show called Detonation, where he interviewed a lot of transhumanist thinkers as well as others. He and I had conversations about the Australian electoral system, and I realized, well, in Australia, they've implemented this already with great success. So it served as validation. I also knew prior to that that Maine had adopted the ranked preference system of voting, and more recently, Alaska adopted it as well. So it is an idea that is spreading. It is gradually taking hold. And I would say in jurisdictions where the authorities are competent, so I'm excluding New York City from that characterization, but in jurisdictions where right, the authorities are competent and numerate, ranked preference voting can work very well and people understand it. And I think it gives people a sense of empowerment.
I completely agree. And I even think that there's a lot of fear when we speak of democratizing votes, like having just switching up the system that we currently have, where we have electorates and just letting the people vote. There's a lot of worries about that. And our founders even discussed this in the Federalist Papers about mob rule potentially and wanting to prevent that. And it seems to me that a good deterrent to that would be ranked based voting, because then you're going to find the common ground. That's essentially what you're doing. If you may not get your number one, you might get your number three choice. And you know what? You voted for that person. So that gives you some sense of validation. Whereas in today's world, we have debates whether or not our elections are rigged, and people don't know if their votes are counted. So that would be a good solution, in my opinion. And I was totally unaware that Maine and Alaska have already implemented that. So that's really awesome that it's starting to get widespread adoption, and hopefully it becomes ubiquitous across political systems. I think it would help humanity by and large doing something like that. It would be more inclusive. Now, to kind of go back around to the philosophical view, I was curious if the Cosmism philosophy played any role in any influence in your thinking. And if so, are there any, I'll say, spiritual implications to that?
Yes, in a certain indirect way, even before I became explicitly aware of Russian Cosmism. Now, it is essentially a precursor to transhumanism during the latter years of the Russian Empire, the late 19th century, early 20th century. There were thinkers, most notably Nikolai Fyodorov, who was a philosopher who posited that essentially through the progress of science and technology, one day, even all the people who had died could be resurrected. But he advocated technological progress combined with the common task of humankind to overcome suffering and disease and death. So that was Russian Cosmism. And Russian Cosmism survived after the socialist revolution in November of 1917, but it survived in a somewhat transformed way, in that the Soviet regime was secular. It was interested in rapid modernization, industrialization. It was interested in showing the Western world that communism could do better than capitalism. And it adapted some of the ideas of the Russian cosmists, of course, framed them in a more socialistic manner. But the pursuit of space exploration, for instance, was, of course, very much encouraged. And a student of Fyodorov named Konstantin Tsiolkovsky was an engineer. He conceptually designed a lot of rockets. He died before the actual space program was launched, but he was revered as the theoretical father of the Soviet space program. And he also held these cosmist beliefs. So he also held to the sense of purpose. And the Soviet regime, for all of its problems, it was not hostile to this idea that eventually, through scientific and technological progress, fundamental human problems could be overcome. So I remember as a child reading a textbook on physiology from the 1950s, in which there was a chapter that was titled Old Age is a Disease. And it discussed some of the early scientific experiments that were made, for instance, keeping animal heads alive, having very rudimentary artificial hearts. And it posited the potential for lifespan to be greatly extended once the causes of the disease of old age could be discovered and overcome. So that stuck with me from an early age, especially because I had already committed to fighting against death and disease. So this line of intellectual influence from the Russian cosmists eventually came to me through this kind of distorted medium of the old Soviet textbooks, which were the textbooks that were available to me as a child, but I think they were still able to preserve the core of that ambition. Now, I would say I'm not myself a religious person. I wouldn't even use the adjective spiritual to refer to myself. So unlike Fyodorov, who was an Orthodox Christian, I am an atheist, but I see possibilities for both secular and religious versions of transhumanism. And I will say part of this big tent is this diversity of views on religion, whether or not there's a God, what faith, if any, or what philosophy, what metaphysics one adheres to. A lot of them can be compatible with transhumanism, and there is a Christian Transhumanist Association out there. There's a Mormon Transhumanist Association. There are Jewish transhumanists, Buddhist transhumanists, even some Muslim transhumanists, and it really depends on how they interpret their beliefs and their religion, and whether they see their religion as being compatible with some fundamental transformations of humanity, or whether they see it more as a static system rooted in the status quo. It seems to me a lot of established organized religion is a barometer of the status quo of about 30 to 40 years prior. And religions evolve too. Organized, established religions evolve. They eventually have to keep up with the times, accept certain realities, but they do it perhaps more slowly than other aspects of the culture. But there are other branches or sects or organizations or denominations that may be more forward-thinking. And we certainly are quite welcoming of individuals from those points of view who would like to be a part of the transhumanist movement and help advance it.
Right. And one thing that I thought about in regards to the Christian transhumanist, the Buddhist transhumanist, the Jewish transhumanist, is regardless of your religious viewpoint, I think that they serve a purpose because in some way, shape, or form, they're going to preserve human history. Like, it may not be completely accurate. Like, I'm not saying, they're telling human history accurately, but there are nuggets of truth in them. In one example, it's fiction. It's from the Foundation series, which I'm sure you've read. They went to this one planet. This is in the prequel. They went to this one planet where everybody had their head shaved. So they were talking about or alluding to Earth on this planet. And they had some kernel of truth about what Earth was, although they didn't have all of it. And so I view that as these religions progress and evolve, they're going to do some justice in preserving humanity's history. Now, I am a little curious as to why it is maybe you haven't always been an atheist, but you went to Hillsdale College, is that correct?
I did go to Hillsdale College, and I was an atheist before I went to Hillsdale College. I was an atheist while I was there, which was interesting. I was an atheist after I left.
All right. So, okay, I guess that kind of answers my question. So why did you choose that school? Because to me, from what I understand, it's a pretty conservative Christian school, and Christianity, by and large, seems to be in total opposition to what you believe, not just atheism, but transhumanism.
Well, Hillsdale is interesting, and I will say that when I was a student there was a heavy Christian influence, but it was non-denominational and it was not imposed on the student body. So there was no requirement to have any particular set of religious beliefs. This wasn't Liberty University or anything even remotely close to that. Mostly the focus was on the classical Western liberal arts tradition, and that included the influences of Christianity. So certainly students were taught in literature courses, in history courses, and philosophy courses how Christianity and the worldviews involved therein influenced those subjects. But I saw that more as part of a general education, a general understanding of humankind's past and of ongoing cultural influences. So I didn't have a problem with that at all. Now, I did have a problem with a decision that the Hillsdale administration made after I graduated, though I knew it was coming close to my graduation, which was for the new students who were incoming, the core curriculum would now include a requirement to take a theology course. And I believe that was implemented several years after I had graduated. So I will say I missed that particular requirement. I graduated from Hillsdale back when it was still technically a secular, non-denominational institution. Now, why did I choose to go there? There were several reasons. First, it had an excellent economics program and still does, and one could learn about certain economic ideas and schools of thought, like the Austrian School of Economics or the Chicago School or the Public Choice School, that really wouldn't be emphasized in many other economics programs. Also, Hillsdale has highly qualified professors and a low ratio of students to professors. So one could get a lot of time to directly interact with professors and not be taught by teaching assistants, but rather go to the professors directly. So I might have had the attention of the professors in a given class about 40% of the time as an individual, and I'm not exaggerating. So that was an advantage. Another advantage was Hillsdale accepted all of my advanced placement credits. Some colleges are a lot pickier than that. Hillsdale gave me a 3/4 merit scholarship for 3 of my 4 years and a full tuition scholarship for 1 of the 4 years. So that was another advantage. Very few colleges these days give merit-based scholarships. So based on these considerations of what the environment would be like, what I would receive, I was able to get 3 majors completed in 4 years of study. And I thought it was a less intense regimen than my high school experience was, just because I had more freedom to structure it in the way I wanted to. I probably ended up doing more work, but with fewer kind of inane institutional restrictions that I faced in high school. So for me, I think it was a good decision academically to have gone there. I certainly believe that I learned certain fundamental skills about how to approach the world. That being said, of course, I disagreed extensively with a lot of the views of the administration, especially when it came to religion and its role. And their brand of Christianity probably would be more resistant to transhumanism. They would say, well, this is not a part of true human nature, and they and I would have some disagreements about what is human nature. Is human nature really as fixed and unchanging as they would characterize it to be? And moreover, do we need to accept the flawed components of that package that they would define as human nature, or is it really our nature to overcome those components? So I am still happy to have debates with people from Hillsdale College on those issues. And I think there may be at least a decently sized contingent of Hillsdale professors and students who would be sympathetic to aspects of my positions.
Well, that's certainly good that, you were able to thrive in an environment which in the real world would almost be hostile. And I say the real world because college is almost like it's not really, I think you get where I'm going with that. It's not like, if you interact with somebody at like your local Baptist church, it's not going to be the same, or, you're a person who's knocking on the door asking if, Jesus is your savior. It wouldn't be the same as going to Hillsdale or, or college in general. Now, you studied economics, and I think this is a good time to tie in cryptocurrencies and the transhumanist movement. Now, I know the two are obviously separate, but when it comes to politics is obviously influenced by the culture, and the culture and the economy go hand in hand. So let's say the Transhumanist Party become what the duopoly is today, right? Or maybe not replacing it to become a monopoly, but rather an actual competitor, right? And so you guys can actually win political races and have a large say in popular culture. How do you see, or how would you like to see the culture of a transhumanist society function? Do you see cryptocurrencies being a part of that? Or do you see other forms of currency, or just in general, how do you see that functioning?
I definitely think that cryptocurrencies are here to stay, and that technology will continue to develop and be more extensively applied in day-to-day life. The question I cannot answer, of course, is which cryptocurrency. I don't think it's going to be Bitcoin, just because the Bitcoin protocol is not equipped to handle the massive volume of transactions that would be needed. But which of the newer generation successor cryptocurrencies will predominate, that will be very interesting to observe. I am not currently invested in any cryptocurrencies, by the way, so I'm not saying this out of any financial motive.
You're not trying to pump your bags.
Exactly. I want to be objective in how I characterize this space, but from the beginning, and I was introduced to Bitcoin in 2011. To be honest, I do kind of regret not having purchased it back then, but I had a different expectation for it. I was more aligned with the original vision of Satoshi Nakamoto, that this would be a decentralized medium of exchange and store of value that could protect people against inflationary monetary policy, as well as other depredations of regimes in other parts of the world. Zimbabwe, of course, would have been a prime example, and the people of Zimbabwe, a few years after their ridiculous hyperinflation, really welcomed Bitcoin and other cryptocurrencies. But to me, they were instruments of individual liberation, and I was looking forward to them being used in transactions more widely. To be honest, I was rather disappointed by them having become primarily speculative instruments for a few years, and by the wild price swings relative to the fiat currencies, because yes, some people could make the argument that fiat currencies are being devalued all the time. There's some degree of inflation and money printing, and sure, that is the case. But to what extent? And could you really say that if the price of a cryptocurrency spikes by 25% or then falls by 10% and then rises again by 5% the next day and falls again by 20% the next day, that that's somehow reflective of anything in the real world? No, that's the prime example of what John Maynard Keynes, not my favorite economist, by the way, but he had some valid insights, called animal spirits, essentially the irrational emotions that motivate speculative behavior. So what I'm interested in terms of cryptocurrencies, are there more fundamental use cases, their transformative potential, and not just for cryptocurrencies per se, but blockchain technology, smart contracts, immutable ledgers that can reliably store information. Of course, then you have to make sure that this is information you want to be immutable and don't want to ever modify. But that could be in our future, even blockchain-based voting systems, where each vote is securely recorded and could be accessed while the identity of the person who is voting remains anonymous to everyone except that actual person. But then that person could verify that, oh yes, I voted, and the system counted my vote exactly as I had intended it to be registered. So
and that's crucial, because a lot of people who want to talk about putting the blockchain on everything, it appears to me they have a lack of understanding as to the use case for blockchain, and it's primarily censorship resistance. That's like what you're using it for. And when you talk about voting, I don't think people think deeply enough on it, because like you said, you need to be able to hide or, preserve the person's identity, so that way we don't devolve into a system where we currently have it. What I mean by that is Congress is bought and paid for by and large, right? And these are things that we can now prove. And so if we don't address these issues with the new technologies, we're just going to fall right back into the same trap. And so it's very encouraging to hear that you're very understanding to this, because a lot of people who are understanding and educated on cryptocurrencies fail to see what it is that blockchain is for. And it's not for everything necessarily. There's certain industries that it'll work better in. And currently, because of the technology, it's only going to be currency. But it'll obviously evolve and hopefully transform into something that we can utilize on a larger scale. Now, I do agree. I see, obviously, cryptocurrencies being a speculative instrument right now, and one day they will be use cases. That's what I envision, and especially with decentralized finance. Now, when you look at the central banks in our political system, there's a lot of corruption there. So how do you think, if you're familiar with DeFi, I'm assuming you are, how do you think DeFi will be influential in our political world and our cultural world?
Well, I think if people have ways of reliably storing large amounts of value, of course, represented as a currency in the absence of intermediaries who can abuse that trust. That would be tremendously empowering. I think a lot of people today struggle with suboptimal banking institutions that charge you a fee for the privilege of lending out your money and earning interest on it, or institutions that have such vast and convoluted bureaucracies that the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. And sometimes they'll offer a personal loan modification at the same time as pursuing a foreclosure process through a different department, and neither area really knows what the other one has decided. Or institutions that give bad incentives to their employees, like Wells Fargo did when it essentially motivated its staff to sell as many additional services as possible. So the employees started inventing fake accounts for people. So all of that would go away with decentralized finance. And I think the problem happens at a scale where the ability for personal trust and personal ethics is lost. I don't see nearly the same kinds of problems, for instance, with local community-based credit unions. Those generally tend to be pretty decent. And there have been some so-called neobanks that try to offer a similar customer experience to a more decentralized, tech-savvy clientele. But those were vulnerable in terms of buyouts and acquisitions by the larger, more traditional banks, who, when they acquired such entities, tended to ruin them, run them into the ground, abuse their customers, and then the customers were back at square one. So I think a lot of people are interested in arrangements where if they put their money, however they earned it, through fiat currency, through cryptocurrency, into those accounts, they can be assured that the money will be there. It won't be nickel and dimed away. There won't be some sort of acquisition or change in management that would transform the environment. And there won't be perverse incentives by some people acting as intermediaries. So any system that is able to achieve that, I think, is going to be tremendously popular.
Now, one thing that I do see that governments are going to have issues with in regards to DeFi is taxes. You know, like a famous example, John McAfee, who recently passed away. But, you know, he was famously known, he was a controversial figure. You know, he endorsed tax evasion. He would explain different ways that one could do so using cryptocurrencies. So with this kind of ability, it obviously changes the relationship between governments and their citizens. Now, how do you see the Transhumanist Party working to, I guess, just prepare for that? Because this is one of the issues that we just see the status quo on. Nobody's really talking, you know, just like transhumanism, it's not really talked about. It's gaining more traction now as far as cryptocurrency, but it's still on the back of everybody's mind, when in reality, it should be something everybody's paying attention to, because the whole economic infrastructure is shifting. It's going to be a hybrid of CeFi and DeFi, but anyway, so how do you see the Transhumanist Party, you know, mediating that relationship between government and their citizen?
So interestingly enough, I actually had the occasion once to moderate a debate of presidential candidates where one of the participants was John McAfee, and he was a refugee at the time, somewhere in Spain. We didn't know exactly where he was because, of course, he wouldn't disclose his location, and we didn't care because we just wanted him to be a participant in our debate. He was certainly quite a character. This was March 15th, 2020, as the pandemic was descending on us. And we held essentially one of the first virtual presidential debates with John McAfee playing a prominent role. Now, he and I have some significant differences in our viewpoints, especially on transhumanism and life extension. He essentially said in that debate that he was ready to go at the age of 74. So that's interesting.
Wild man.
Yes. it was actually interesting for me to go back and listen to his comments after he had died in light of what happened. And it almost seemed like prescient remarks on his part, at least in terms of what would happen to him. But he and I got along despite our obvious differences on that stream. And I was able to kind of in a humorous manner keep him within the parameters of that debate. But it's true that he was advocating some dangerous strategies for people vis-a-vis the governmental authorities. And I certainly would not counsel people to take that risk. My recommendation to anyone watching this, whatever your beliefs, and I certainly dislike aspects of the tax system myself. I consider them convoluted. I consider them overly burdensome. But I would suggest paying one's taxes, doing it honestly, disclosing everything, because that's ultimately the easier way to do it. Unless you want to end up like John McAfee, it's better to just accept that burden and then work to try to change that going forward legitimately. But the evolution of technology is part of that. So what would happen in a world where individuals do have this de facto direct control over their resources? How would government collect its share of revenues to keep operating? Well, it so happens the Transhumanist Party has a proposal for that, and it involves a dramatic simplification of the tax structure, making it seamless to essentially every user and not adding a burden to anyone who already pays taxes. So the proposal, this is part of our platform, is to abolish all of these miscellaneous taxes, including the income tax, property taxes, estate taxes, gift taxes, anything that people have to exert special efforts to account for and pay, and instead to replace them with a single sales tax that is only collected essentially from the businesses that are already equipped today to collect the sales tax. So if you go to a Walmart or a Home Depot right now and you buy something, the sales tax is built in to your check. And we would even advocate for the prices that are posted by these businesses to be inclusive of the sales tax, so that what you see when you shop is the final amount that you're going to pay. And if you buy from an individual, from a small business, from somebody with a revenue amount under a fairly generous threshold, the threshold would be in the millions of dollars, then there wouldn't be that sales tax. Because if you're buying from a small-time retailer or somebody who is just an occasional seller, for that person, setting up the infrastructure to collect and remit sales tax would be a burden, and we don't want to burden anyone. I actually think for the income tax, the greatest burden isn't the amount that is paid, which is often automatically withheld from many people's paychecks. It's having to file that tax return every single year and going through it, making sure that everything is properly accounted for, that there are no inadvertent errors or inconsistencies, or perhaps some strange forms of income that one might not have reported correctly. That's a burden on many individuals, especially people who are self-employed, people who might have small occasional revenue streams, people who invest, people who have cryptocurrencies and then sell them, because that's definitely an evolving area of tax law, to put it mildly. So what if we could get rid of all of that and just say, okay, if you go and shop for something, part of the price you pay is going to be remitted to the US federal government, to your state government via the sales tax. And then you don't have to worry about it. The businesses who do have to worry about it have already done the work to set that up. The small businesses don't have to worry about it. And then we can just move on with our lives. And then if you hold your assets in cryptocurrencies, if they're highly anonymous, highly secure, nobody else can get to them, nobody even knows that you have them, it doesn't matter, because if you go shopping at the Walmart or Home Depot,
you're going to pay taxes.
Yeah, you're going to pay taxes, and you're not going to mind paying taxes either.
Right. That's a really awesome system that you, or proposal rather, that you guys have presented. I know it's definitely something that I like. For a while recently, I've been really liking the volunteerism, where you can decide, like, okay, you're going to have to pay your taxes, but at least give me the choice where I'm going to, who I'm going to support, because maybe I don't want to support the military, right? Maybe I don't want to support the roads and I just want to support healthcare or the schools or whatever. But this is very appealing because it's fair. It's like, you're going to go to the store, you're always going to have to buy something. So you're going to be able to collect your taxes. And so that's a good way to do it. And also you're encouraging the free market to flourish because you're giving the small business owners a break, some leeway, so that way they can become successful into the future. And I think that's important you brought that up, because from my understanding, those who understand transhumanism and are against it, they view it as being almost a Trojan horse for a new communist regime, because there's a lot of different perspectives when it comes to the singularity. And then you have transhumanism and the singularity. You know, for instance, the hive mind, that's one version of the singularity. And so anyway, people that I'm aware of who are against transhumanism, they tend to think that it's, you know, something much more nefarious than presented to be. So that's encouraging that you guys are working on, or just adapting to the new system that's emerging and accepting the reality, because that's something that a lot of people have a hard time with. I see in my personal life, like we've been talking about now, is the status quo. That's a hard thing to shake. But with this proposal, it's very enticing.
Yes, and I will say, with regard to the hive mind, that would be a nightmare scenario in my view, because I am an individualist, both metaphysically and ethically, and I consider it to be the ultimate ethical imperative to preserve the life and the separate existence of the individual. And yes, in the future, there may be ways to communicate directly from one mind to another. But one of the points that I have consistently made during the many discussions we've had on this subject at the US Transhumanist Party virtual enlightenment salons, that any such communication always has to preserve the separate integrity of the individuals involved. So if I choose to share a thought with you, it would be like me sharing my words with you right now. I choose exactly what to communicate and what the limits of that are. You choose whether you accept that or you don't accept that. And if you accept that, it becomes just a part of your perception as a separate individual. What I would never want are two consciousnesses or multiple consciousnesses to be blended together into some sea of consciousness, because if you then attempt to extract or disentangle the individual from that, one, can that even be done? Two, would it be the same individual? There are all of these philosophical problems with that concept, but I would say most transhumanists would share all of the reservations that I articulated, and most of them are in the transhumanist movement because, in large part, they want to preserve themselves. And different transhumanists have different views on what would preserve the self. For instance, we have discussions about whether uploading one's mind into a computer would preserve the same self or create a copy of the self, provided that it can be done from a technical standpoint. And I'm of the view, actually, that you shouldn't do destructive uploading. You should only engage in gradual processes of transformation where the same organism might receive certain artificial upgrades, even say artificial neurons, perhaps, but you shouldn't be destroying the original. You should be adding to it or replacing what is already defective. And that way you could augment the human being's capabilities, but that person would remain the same individual, just growing rather than having a copy be made in some other medium.
Right. Now, what are your views on parapsychology? This is an emerging field in itself. I mean, it's been talked about for years and documented and things of that nature. And I know that that's also a contentious area because some people call it pseudoscience. Others accept it as gospel, as if it's true. And tying that in with the hive mind, like in the sea of consciousness, some people already think because of this parapsychology that we live in a sea of consciousness. What are your views on that?
So I am a scientific materialist in the sense that I don't give any credence to paranormal phenomena that cannot be demonstrated using scientific techniques of evidence. And there have been a lot of great people who have attempted to explain these phenomena in terms of what is actually going on. And sometimes these phenomena are stage tricks. Other times they're tricks that the external reality plays on our minds. But if you think of, for instance, the work that James Randi has done, or the work that Penn and Teller have done in actually showing people how some of these phenomena might come about or be engineered and how the human mind can be tricked. That's the school of thought that I adhere to with regard to these phenomena. Now, that's not to say there aren't any phenomena that we can explain yet. There are. Even the US federal government published a report in June of this year saying there have been hundreds of sightings of unidentified flying objects and we don't know what they are. And I think in those cases, the proper approach would be to say, if we don't have the complete evidence, then we don't have the complete evidence. We should look into those phenomena further, try to understand what they are. But I think the general categories of phenomena are going to be consistent with a rational scientific view of the world. So I don't think there exist ghosts or spirits that haunt particular places. If some phenomena looks like a ghost or a spirit, well, it could be any of a number of physical causes, and it might be interesting to consider, well, what physical phenomena give rise to that perception or that illusion. But I can pretty much say this doesn't prove that there's a spirit world that science can't explain.
Right. And I kind of share a similar view as you do in that regard. Although I would say I'm a little more spiritual, although I lean towards more so agnostic. But it reminds me of this. My dad and I were talking over the phone not long ago, and he has these security cameras on the outside of his house. And he's like you and I, not really believing the paranormal activity. You know, I've never been a believer of ghosts or anything like that. But he was telling me that he was looking at his camera, and he kept sawing this light just bouncing around all over the place, like erratically. And he was like, what the heck is that? So he goes outside to check it out. Nothing's there. And then he goes back inside and he says that, you know, he was watching this for an hour or two and it just didn't go away. But like most people, from my experience, they tend to gravitate towards something paranormal or spiritual, or this is a sign, this is a relative talking to me, or something like that. But you know, he was like, no, I figured it was probably just a glitch, or maybe, the lighting system could be off. It could be a bug, could be multiple things. So I thought that was pretty funny. But I want to circle back around to how you say you're scientific minded. Now, and I know that this is part of the three principles or the three core values in transhumanism, and that's reason, science, and technology. Is that correct?
Well, the three core ideals of the US Transhumanist Party are, number one, pursuit of significant life extension through science and technology. The second core ideal discusses a rational societal and political framework founded on reason, science, and secular values. And the third core ideal discusses the use of science, technology, and rational discourse to mitigate and eliminate existential risk.
Gotcha. I knew I was butchering it when I said ideals, because I was like, that is not the word I'm looking for. But anyways, so science. There's a reproducibility crisis in science right now, and that's something that a lot of people who are conspiracy theorists or even dubbed, self-proclaimed truthers, if you will, like to point out when it comes to maybe somebody of your leaning that is a scientific materialist. How do you see these problems being resolved? And will the Transhumanist Party maybe have some role in that?
Now, I think the reproducibility crisis is quite real. I don't think it's a problem with science per se. I would say it's a problem with institutions and bad societal incentives that can lead the science to be corrupted and distorted. And this stems, I think, from the phenomenon that we observe in every era, where every era has certain aspects of life or certain pursuits that are venerated and are seen as conferring prestige. So in the medieval world, that was the role of religion. But there were a lot of people in the medieval world who really weren't interested in even an honest understanding or interpretation or application of religion. Think of many of the medieval popes, or think of the relic peddlers, the people who would just dig up old bones and pose them as relics of saints so that gullible people would give them money and make pilgrimages to these relics. It was an entire industry, or the people who sold indulgences. So those people, even from the standpoint of individuals who are sincerely religious, who think that religions are the source of truth and moral value, would consider those people to be corrupting the application of religion, channeling it into something that it was never meant to be. And in our era, science, the concept of science, is venerated in a similar way. And it's understandable why. The applications of the scientific method have led to far more real solutions to human problems than religion in the Middle Ages ever did or could. And as a result, it confers a great amount of prestige on a person to claim to be scientific or to have achieved a result in accordance with the science. Moreover, there's a lot of institutional pressure, the publish or perish mentality in academia, which is very detrimental to the true spirit of scientific inquiry. Because within the true spirit of scientific inquiry, negative results, not arriving at some breakthrough after pursuing a certain approach, are in many ways just as valuable as those occasional fundamental breakthroughs. Not everybody who pursues a PhD is going to make a major discovery. Most scientists are going to work their entire lives without revolutionizing their field. But that's fine. That should be accepted as part of the job of a scientist, to explore pathways that may not work out and to honestly report what one observes. If experiments are structured in a way that they would be difficult to repeat or reproduce, it may be because there are perverse incentives within academia where somebody wants to achieve something noteworthy and publish a paper that gets accepted into a high-profile peer-reviewed journal instead of really seeking the truth through the scientific method. So I would say when one sees problems like that within a paradigm that offers some value, it's better to look at the human dynamics, the institutional dynamics, and try to figure out what is amiss here. Because not everyone who uses the word science necessarily is going to do good science. And moreover, not every politician or government official who does something in the name of science is going to implement the correct policy. And I do think we need to be vigilant about that. We need to consider science from the standpoint of a rational and rationally skeptical person following the scientific method, evaluating the evidence, being willing to consider what would happen if a particular hypothesis were overturned and what other possible explanations of an observed phenomena can exist.
Right. Now, something that I see taking place with science right now is it's morphing into a religion, it appears. As you were saying, it was used as a political narrative. You know, people seem to be extremely divided on this too, this issue. And I think it has a lot to do with science, like I said in the beginning, morphing into a religion.
I do think that there are people who approach science with a kind of quasi-religious mentality. I do think very often ulterior motives lurk behind that, not for ordinary people, but for politicians and especially their public relations consultants who use that kind of rhetoric to manipulate people into supporting one side or the other. I think for many people, it's difficult to really become an expert in a scientific field. One really does have to study for many years. One has to know how to read a paper and understand not just the qualitative nature of its findings, but also what is a statistically significant result, for instance, because many studies, they're not definitive binary yes or no kinds of findings. They're statistical findings. And there is a certain margin of error, a certain confidence interval for each result. And moreover, it's definitely possible that a different set of conditions in which an experiment was performed could give rise to different outcomes. So all of that, a trained scientist will understand how to approach, but a layperson might not. So a layperson might think that certain conclusions or pronouncements are more absolute than they actually are. In fact, science continues to evolve. Our understanding of the universe continues to change. And I think there's a vulnerability when the scientific method is replaced by a list of dogmas. So people will say, well, the science has discovered X, Y, and Z. And it may well be that X, Y, and Z are true, or they're more likely than not to be true. But at the same time, the reason why we should accept those outcomes isn't because of the outcomes themselves. It's because of the underlying integrity of the process that brought them about, if the process was followed with integrity. And even then, the acceptance would be provisional in the sense that, yes, we think this is likely to be true, at least within the context in which it was discovered. We may discover something else later on that will supplement that picture, or we'll say this might be a special case, but in the general case, something else might also happen at times. It's like the idea that for a while, Europeans only observed white swans, and then they came to Australia, and in Australia, there are black swans. So to say all swans are white, well, for someone who spent his life in Europe in entirety, that might have been a good enough generalization to go by on a day-to-day basis. And that's what science is really good at too. Right. If you have these generalizations, they may not be absolutely true for the entire universe 100% of the time, but they may be good enough for you to develop technologies that work to fulfill human purposes. But then you have to be ready for those black swans. And I think that's a matter of mindset. That's a matter of cultivating scientific reasoning skills rather than just a laundry list of information that science has discovered and that people would accept.
Right. And I think a big issue too is the censorship that takes place when it comes to opposing views. This has been ramping up as we continuously divide in our nation. Now, as a political party, the Transhumanists, what are your guys' views on censorship? And I do believe there's a role for censorship. However, I do think that there is a point where you become too overreaching rather. Now, so where do you guys stand when it comes to censorship?
Well, we're opposed to censorship of the civil expression of ideas, most definitely. So for a private organization, and I think we need to make a distinction also between governments and private organizations. Right. Governments should not be censoring speech, period, as long as it's not incitement to violence, for instance, right. Which I would say is not really speech. It's more of a plan to commit some violent act. So that's not within the realm of, say, the First Amendment. But speech, even if it's obnoxious or hateful, government should not be involved in suppressing that at all. A private organization, of course, has the right to determine what content it does or does not endorse, will or will not provide resources for. That being said, I think there are ethical standards that should be followed. It's clear that if, for instance, I go to your house, you have the right to determine the rules of admission to your house. But if I accidentally say the word cat in your house, just an offhand mention, maybe you hate cats, probably not. But if you did, you might expel me from your house for saying the word cat. And that would be unfair, I would say. That would be unreasonable. And I think what a lot of social media platforms have been doing has been similarly unreasonable. And I think the reason for that isn't even because of the specific content of someone's expression. It's because of this presumption that they know 100% what the truth is on a given subject, and no further discussion or debate is allowed. And in the transhumanist community, we've seen some ridiculous outcomes of that, because that censorship gets applied algorithmically. And that's even worse than a fallible human being making that decision, because there's often no rationale, no recourse, no due process. So for instance, Lincoln Cannon, who is the founder of the Mormon Transhumanist Association, was banned from Facebook. His entire account was deleted. There was no possibility for appeal. And what did he do? He linked to an article by Ben Goertzel, another famous transhumanist, about decentralized social networks. So the Facebook algorithm picked up on an article about decentralized social networks as somehow being a threat. To what is it a threat, I wonder? And then, right. So another case happened with Jim Rutt, whom we had an excellent discussion with in a previous Virtual Enlightenment salon. He is one of the founders of the Game B community, and he got algorithmically banned for a few weeks as well. And we were speaking with him about why he thought that might be the case. And in his community, there's a lot of detailed intellectual exploration of ideas. So they're also quite fond of open discourse, and they have these sophisticated conversations, not your typical social media one-line posts or memes. And his speculation is the algorithms picked up on that, and the algorithms saw a structural similarity between that kind of conversation and the kinds of conversations that conspiracy theorists like the QAnon people would engage in, because they also have sophisticated narratives. It's just those sophisticated narratives are based on completely bizarre and misguided premises. But the algorithms, they don't understand content. They just look at structure, patterns, and sometimes they're wildly off. Another situation occurred with Dan Elton, who is our director of scholarship for the US Transhumanist Party. And at one point, he made a post essentially pointing out some false statements that were made by an individual with a pseudonym of Ben Zion. This person isn't actually Jewish. He culturally appropriated the name Ben Zion, and he was spreading some false accusations. And Dan Elton essentially had a group that he named Countering Ben Zion's Libels. And I think what happened with him was the algorithm saw a Jewish name with the word libel next to it. And of course, there exists the infamous blood libel, and Jewish people have been libeled throughout history. And maybe the algorithm thought this was an anti-Semitic expression. And so he was banned. And then a few weeks later, the ban was reversed. And again, no explanation was given. And I think what happened was, in the wake of the January 6th attack on the Capitol building, these social networks dialed up the sensitivity of the algorithms to an absurd extent. And then they realized all of the false positives that were being flagged, and they dialed down the sensitivity once again. And then it became apparent that, all of those accounts, they were innocuous. They shouldn't have been banned. But when one admits the premise that one may use these algorithms to censor content, that's where the trouble starts, because there would be no guarantee that only false information, that only misleading information or bad information would be censored. The good information will inevitably be caught up in that web. And we've seen that on a macro scale with the hypothesis of the novel coronavirus escaping from a lab, which was originally banned on social media. And now the Biden administration is seriously exploring that hypothesis. Now, I don't have a definitive view on whether or not that's true, but it's within the realm of respectable discourse, certainly. And it should have been from the very start.
Right. So this obviously applies to the First Amendment, the censorship thing. It's a huge issue that's occurring right now. But as you said, private businesses have have some leeway when it comes to what's acceptable and what's not acceptable on their premises. And, that's like with Facebook, the bots that they've created to try to find extremist and, innocuous people are getting, punished for doing something that isn't extreme. Now, where this leads me to next is, do you, as far as the political party, the Transhumanist Party, want to make any constitutional changes? Because I know even within our current systems, there's talk about the validity of our Constitution today. Should we still be using this antiquated thing? It's not antiquated, but that is almost the way that it's portrayed, that it's old and it needs to be modified or do away with, or adjusted in some way. So do you guys view the Constitution as something that is to be preserved or to be modified?
The US Transhumanist Party platform is compatible with the Constitution as it is now. And I don't think major constitutional amendments would be required to implement the future of advanced technology and unlimited lifespans that transhumanists envision. Now, the Constitution has evolved over time. There's an amendment process built into the Constitution, and there may be some amendments that could be justified. I don't think we're at a point where we should have a new constitutional convention, and especially that would be risky because the Bill of Rights could be jeopardized. So having the protections of the First Amendment, the Fourth Amendment, the 10th Amendment, in many cases is empowering for technological innovation. And not every country's constitution has those protections. So for instance, in Great Britain, there's no real written constitution. There's no guarantee of freedom of speech. It's just a cultural tradition that most speech is tolerated. But we saw, for instance, what could happen to a particular broadcaster who criticized a particular former member of the British royal family, and there were no free speech protections for this individual. He had to rely on essentially his fan base to support him after that. But in the United States, he might have a case, at least for a wrongful termination lawsuit, especially if he was fired from a governmental channel for just voicing his views. So it's really important to have these guarantees in the Bill of Rights because they protect the people who are different, the people who are in the minority on a particular issue. And no matter how much our society progresses, there are going to be differing points of view, differing attempts at innovation. And the rights of the people who aren't in the majority already need to be safeguarded. And also, I think right now, given the current political and ideological climate, let's work on policy, legislation at the federal level, at the state and local level, see what we can do within the bounds of the Constitution. If we absolutely need to amend the Constitution, let's follow the amendment process, which is here for a reason. That is how slavery was abolished. That is how women got the right to vote. That is how a lot of beneficial changes were enacted after the American founding.
Right. And I'm glad that you brought up those two amendments that were added, slavery and the right for women to vote, because another issue that you run into is people think any change to the Constitution is tarnishing America and what it is. But in my view, the founders created the Constitution so that way we can evolve as a nation. I think they understood that we were going to, outgrow where we were then, where they were. I would imagine that they envisioned some sort of technological future. I want to switch gears a little bit. I do want to talk a little bit about the other things that you do. You're sort of a polymath, if I will. So you're a sci-fi novelist and you're an artist. And before we started the recording, we were talking a little bit about your art. And the one that stuck out to me in particular was the Jesus and Substance. But I want to talk more about why you are attempting to start this new movement in art called Abstract Orderism.
Yes. So I see a lot of beauty in patterns, and patterns exist, of course, both in nature as well as in man-made objects. And it rather disappointed me that throughout the 20th century, most abstract art was chaotic. It seemed to be more of a rebellion against tradition for rebellion's sake. And these kinds of abstract artists were trying to just express some raw, untamed emotion, which doesn't interest me at all, because I want art to be uplifting. I want it to be engaging to the human mind. I want people to be able to make sense of it and to derive some benefit from it in terms of their lives, how it improves their quality of life. So I'm quite fond of representational art as well. However, I'm not a painter. I'm more of a mathematician. So I can create objects using mathematical principles, and objects that are complex and structured and interesting to look at and contemplate. Fractals are a great example of that, and a lot of my abstract orderism works are fractals. But the idea is abstract art doesn't have to be disordered. It doesn't have to be ugly. It can be beautiful. It can be systematic. It can be ornate. And that's what abstract orderism tries to bring about? What kinds of new ways of order, new types of beauty can be discovered and represented? And there are many possibilities for abstract orderism that haven't been tapped yet. Of course, with digital art, there are a lot of creative possibilities that wouldn't have been accessible in the past. Actually, to draw a geometric object precisely or to paint it precisely would have been a fairly significant endeavor for someone working in traditional media. Working in digital media, it's a lot easier. So the barriers to entry are lowered. But imagine what could happen with this art form, say, in 3 dimensions with holograms, or perhaps an attempt to, say, represent a hypercube in 3 dimensions and have people contemplate that. So it's fuel for thinking, for contemplation, for perhaps finding an uplifting way to experience the world that didn't exist before and that wouldn't have existed otherwise.
Yeah, it is thought-provoking and uplifting too. I really like the dome fractal art piece that you have, and I like the fractal tree as well. There's a bunch of others that I can't just rattle off by name. I think there was another one called like Fractal 85 or something that you used as your thumbnail and your cover for a composition as well, a musical composition. So that's another thing. You're a musician too. So that's really impressive that you're able to, I would go as far as to say, maybe master a bunch of different disciplines. So that's very fascinating. Now, would you say your abstract orderism is sort of a rebellion to, I view the abstract art to be in line with postmodernism. So I'm not sure if you would agree with that, but if it is the case, would you say that yours is more a rebellion, or maybe even working in conjunction with postmodernism, since it's essentially deconstruction and you're just looking at things in a different way?
I am very much trying to transcend the postmodern paradigm in that I do think it was a bit of a detour in the wrong direction. I understand what motivated it in the early 20th century, the devastation of World War I, the rise of a lot of economic uncertainty of totalitarian regimes led to a crisis of meaning. But at the same time, I think the postmodernists, even though they had some valid critiques, they rejected all of the fundamental aspects that were good about Western societies and that had brought humans to unprecedented heights in terms of quality of life, length of life, and opportunity. So I see a lot of my work, including in the realms of art and music, as trying to reinstantiate some of those principles from the modern era, philosophically speaking. That would be from the Renaissance to the early 20th century, of course, with some reactions and holdouts in various parts of the Western world during that time. But the modern paradigm was essentially one of using reason, science, and technology to improve human life. But we today have many more opportunities for doing that, an entire new generation of emerging technologies that could, instead of just incrementally ameliorating certain types of suffering or suboptimality, overcome them altogether. And so this is definitely the paradigm that follows postmodernism and rejects the implicit hopelessness within postmodernism. So postmodernism, it is about deconstructing, but is it constructing anything in place of what it has deconstructed?
Nihilistic.
Right. And I don't think people can thrive in that kind of thought system. I don't think societies can thrive in that kind of thought system. People need a source of meaning and purpose. And we see a lot of people, unfortunately, flocking to suboptimal sources of meaning and purpose. That is what Wahhabist Islam is. People who find no sense of meaning in this postmodern paradigm, and they go back to a very brutal paradigm that has very definitive answers for them. Of course, we don't want that. The pre-modern systems were highly flawed, as well. And the thinkers of the modern era recognized that and rejected them for that reason. So we want sources of meaning that are actually anchored to genuine human well-being, and restoring the confidence in progress, the conviction that life tomorrow can be better than it is today. Life in 10 years can be even better if we apply certain tools and techniques. That is, I think, essential. And that is what transhumanism advocates. There are other terms for this paradigm shift that I describe. Sometimes it's called transmodernism or hypermodernism, but it's taking the best of the modern era and also recognizing we can't undo the postmodern era. We're always going to have some of those critical tools, but we have to realize, notwithstanding our ability to criticize and deconstruct, we need to build as well, and building should be more primary than deconstructing.
It's the polarity. So basically, you're just finishing, you're just doing the other half with the deconstruction. You're building, you're encouraging the building, the creation, as opposed to the complete destruction, which is essential. And it seems that in times of a lot of progress, we have these people flocking to two extremes. And like you said, with the Muslims of some sect that you were referring to, they're reverting back to older ways and older paradigm. And you're seeing that today as well. There's a lot of people who are becoming more conservative and just going back to the older way of living and thinking that that's the only way to do so. But this seems to be a pattern in human history. Every time we go through some big changes, there's always this polarization that takes place. But then there's people like, I thought of Nietzsche when you were talking about transcending the postmodernist thinking, because I know people would consider him the grandfather of postmodernism, if I'm not mistaken, and even if nihilism. However, and maybe I'm wrong in my interpretation of Nietzsche, but I tended to see him more so as not in line with, yes, he was expressing those viewpoints, however, beyond good and evil, right? That's a good example right there. And reading Thus Spoke Zarathustra. So would you say that maybe Nietzsche had any influence on your thinking as far as this art form goes, and your wanting to create the construction to the deconstruction, just to finish the polarity there?
I think there are definitely aspects of Nietzsche that are supportive of that. Now, I don't agree with him on everything, but I do agree with him on the importance of the individual, essentially transcending the social and cultural milieu and essentially creating new ways, new forms of pursuing meaning, which could be higher than what is available through one's culture or set of traditions. Now, sometimes I think Nietzsche finds himself on the wrong side of the distinctions that he creates, for instance, between the Apollonian and the Dionysian. I'm very much fond of the Apollonian side that he portrays, and I know that's not necessarily what Nietzsche would have thought. Nietzsche was a bit too anti-rationalist in my view. I think applied rationality is essential, even if it leads to some fairly conventional conclusions in certain fields, provided that they can be backed up with reason and evidence. But I also am on the same side as Nietzsche in that I consider individualism to be essential. I consider uplifting the individual person, not having what Nietzsche described as a slave mentality. That's essential as well. And Nietzsche, contrary to the people who distorted and misinterpreted his works, he was never about subjugating people. He was never about superior or inferior groups of people.
And you're referring to what the Nazis did with his philosophy, I'm assuming, right?
Right. The Nazis completely misunderstood and distorted his views. No, Nietzsche, in his conception of the Übermensch, was about individuals elevating themselves. And for him, there was a spiritual component to that. But I think in transhumanism, there is a very similar core. The idea is the individual decides to pursue these innovations in technology, in longevity, in the scientific approach to the world. And that benefits the individual, first of all. But if we all do it, that will benefit the entire society.
Right. I agree with your points. I want to talk a little bit about how you got into music, You have a running playlist on your YouTube channel as well, what you listen to when you run. You have your musical compositions on there as well. So are you just mainly focusing on like the classical type of music? Or I guess I'm transitioning into two different questions now. So the first question would be, how did you get into music? And are there other types of music that you create or even listen to?
Well, I took piano lessons as a child, and I certainly was no child prodigy. Essentially, I took piano lessons because my parents wanted me to be a well-rounded person. And I found that in the course of those piano lessons, I was a lot more drawn toward experimenting with melodies that occurred to me and then developing them than I was with just performing works composed by others. I suppose I knew even in my early teens that, well, of course, there are going to be pianists who are far more skilled than I am at doing that. And the best I could do is perhaps play a piece flawlessly. But what I was really interested in is what I could create. And I listened to immense amounts of classical music from the time I was about 9. I've probably listened to an average of 12 hours a day of classical music. And I have heard the complete works of certain composers like Chopin, John Field, and even Beethoven, to the extent that those works have been published online or offered in a CD format. I've heard them. So over the years, I've developed this kind of depth of familiarity. And in my own compositions, I certainly am influenced by the great classical composers. At the same time, I was focused on what could I bring into this world? What could I discover in the course of that experimentation? And starting in late 2007, I discovered various composition programs, and I realized there's a potential for composing music that sounds good, harmonious, structured, uplifting, interesting, that might not be playable by human beings. This is the transhumanist aspect, but computers and instruments that sound increasingly realistic, increasingly reminiscent of acoustic instruments can bring those combinations of sounds into being, and we can experience them and enjoy them and derive some value from them. So I shifted over time into computer-based composition. I think most of the pieces I've composed since then would be very difficult for human beings to play at the very least, or they would have interesting combinations of instruments, maybe anachronistic ones like the piano and the harpsichord being played together, or an organ coming in during the last minute of a longer composition. Probably there would be some setup required in a real world performance for that, but I still composed some pieces for solo piano as well. And I, again, have great respect for the musical traditions of the Western world. I think my music is grounded in them, but it also seeks to explore the possibilities of technology. My latest composition is a musical expression of prime numbers, the prime numbers from 2 to 4,817 in base 10, which is 20,021 in base 7. I could have gone to 2021 in base 7, but it would have been a fairly short composition. So I chose to see if I could go to 20,021 and still have it sound interesting and harmonious. It won't sound like Mozart or Beethoven, of course. I had to work with some fairly significant constraints, but I think that was the first time that the prime numbers were expressed in a fairly harmonious manner. So I think I combine that rootedness in traditions, especially with regard to harmony, meter, structure in general, with technological exploration and seeing what new creations can be brought into being. Now, in terms of my running playlist, I recognize there are other genres of music that draw upon those principles. Of course, ragtime is a close relative of classical music, just with some different rhythms, syncopation, but computer game music and film music, for example, I think those will actually be remembered as the artistic music of the late 20th and early 21st century, more so than a lot of the academic music that gets composed these days. So for instance, someone like John Williams or Christopher Tin, who composed the music for the Civilization series, are great composers within the classical traditions, and they're innovative as well, but their music is quite memorable and it resonates with a lot of audiences, and it takes the art in new, interesting directions.
Yeah, and I will say, going through your playlist, I didn't get a chance to listen to all of your songs that you've created. But so with art, whether it be writing, actually doing artwork itself, painting, drawing, or making music, I think it's a good way to look into a person's soul, if you will, for a lack of better term. And I will say that the feeling that I get from looking at your paintings and listening to some of the compositions is very inspiring, uplifting, and just a positive all-around vibe to it. And so I dabble in a little bit of classical music. I'm not a big fan myself. I'm more so into like a celloist. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Zoe Keaton or Takanabu, I believe is his name. But those are two musicians who I listen to occasionally. But listening to your music, it's refreshing because you can tell that it has the classical vibe to it. However, it's incorporating modern day equipment. And so that's pretty cool. It's a good incorporation. And I just want a little bit of clarification. When you were talking about the game music, the film music, were you in any way referring to like synthwave, like that kind of genre?
I was more referring to a lot of the melodies for the Star Trek music or for computer games. There was a lot of great video game music composed. Mm-hmm. Some of that music is synthesized. Some of that music is orchestral. It can be played using many different instruments and arrangements. That's actually one of the really fascinating and I would say highly progressive aspects of our digital age. It's very easy to rearrange a composition for a different set of instruments so you could hear a different sound and still have it be interesting and inspiring.
Yeah, for sure. So where are some places where people can find you? And maybe, because you said the memberships are free if they were interested in becoming a member of the Transhumanist Party. So where can they find you, and where can they find more information on the Transhumanist Party and join if they were interested?
Yes, certainly. So for the Transhumanist Party, please go to our website at transhumanist-party.org, and there will be a link for free membership at the top of the page. Also, the direct URL is transhumanist-party.org/membership. We have a lot of content on our website as well. You can read our platform, our constitution, the Transhumanist Bill of Rights. You can read many articles and posts and news updates that we provide there. To find out more about me, you can visit my YouTube channel at youtube.com/GStolyarov. That's G. Stolyarov II. That is my username on YouTube. And you can also visit The Rational Argumentator, which is my online magazine, rationalargumentator.com. You can find me on Facebook. You can follow me on Instagram. You can follow the US Transhumanist Party on Facebook and Instagram as well. There's a Facebook group called Transhumanist Party, which you can join. There are various state-specific Transhumanist Party Facebook groups as well. The Facebook page is called US Transhumanist Party, and that is where we post our updates as well. I am on Twitter as Gennady Stolyarov II. The Transhumanist Party is on Twitter. The Twitter handle is US Transhumanist. So there are many different ways to keep up with our endeavors.
One last question for you. If somebody were interested in creating in a state where it doesn't have it already, a Transhumanist Party, how does that process look? Do they go to you guys, the United States Transhumanist Party, to sort of, get the approval? Or is this something that you just take your own initiative if, a state was interested to do that?
If we do not have a Transhumanist Party in a particular state, and we have a list on our website of which states do have Transhumanist parties, but if we do not, we encourage people to take the initiative and start their own. And of course, let us know. Use our contact information on the Transhumanist Party website and keep us informed of your plans, what kinds of events you're planning to hold, set up a Facebook presence. If you can get your party registered with the Secretary of State, and different states have different requirements, try to do that. But even in a more preliminary stage, you can do a lot of good if you create a core group of transhumanists in a particular city or county or throughout the state. You hold events, you communicate with other people in the general public about transhumanism, you record your presentations, you provide us with written reports of your activity. All of those will help raise the profile of transhumanism in the areas where you reside.
Awesome. Good to know. Gennady, it's been a great conversation, very educational for myself, and I'm sure the viewers too. So I really do appreciate your time. And yeah, man, it's been a great conversation.
Thank you very much, Luis. I enjoyed our discussion as well.
All right. Well, you have a good night.
You do as well. Thank you.
Thank you.